Welcome to Moonlit Inc. BL. A BL story written under moonlight. Let's begin. Chapter 1, The Invisible Pawn. The air in the logistics hub of the Gaia Imperial Command was thick with the smell of ozone and burnt coffee, but beneath it all lay the suffocating, heavy pressure of a predator. General Kyle Avila had been in the building for exactly 10 minutes, and already the oxygen felt expensive. Malcolm Case kept his head down, his fingers flying across a holographic display. To anyone passing by, he was just another unranked logistics officer, a beta whose presence was as unremarkable as the gray slate walls. In reality, the back of his throat burned from the 3 suppressants he'd downed that morning. His scent, the sharp, medicinal spice of Witch Hazel, was locked behind a mental vault, flattened into nothingness. The 4th Battalion is moving toward the Black Reach Pass, a colonel's voice wavered from the central war table. General, if we intercept them there, they will be slaughtered, Kyle Avila interrupted. His voice was like a glacier grinding against stone. Malcolm risked a glance. The general stood over the primary tactical map, his silhouette sharp and imposing in his fur-lined Imperial greatcoat. His scent, winter frost, wasn't just an aroma. It was a physical weight that made the junior officer's hands shake. It was the smell of a man who viewed the world as a series of things to be conquered or discarded. Kyle's gloved hand swept across the map, dragging a glowing red unit marker into the mouth of the pass. We bottle them here. We don't wait for the pincer. We crush them. He's walking them into a grave, Malcolm thought, his heart hammering against his ribs. Malcolm knew the topography of Black Reach better than the surveyors. The thermal vents beneath the permafrost made the ground unstable for heavy artillery. If the 4th Battalion entered that pass, the vibration alone would trigger a crustal collapse. The general began to walk away, his cape snapping behind him, his winter frost aura leaving a trail of shivers in his wake. The room exhaled in relief, but Malcolm's blood was cold for a different reason. As the officers turned to follow the general, Malcolm stepped toward the central table under the guise of clearing the data caches. His hands were steady. He waited for the exact moment the general reached the heavy pressurized doors. With a flick of his wrist, Malcolm accessed the override. He didn't just move the marker, he recalibrated the terrain's density readings. The holographic map flickered, shifting from a stable green to a warning, crystalline violet. He redirected the 4th Battalion's projected path 3 kilometers east, toward the jagged ridges of the Silent Flats. It was a silent, surgical correction. Clack. The sound of a single boot hitting the floor stopped. The general had frozen at the door. Malcolm didn't look up, but he felt the sudden, violent spike in the general's pheromones. The winter frost turned into a blizzard. Kyle Avila turned around slowly, his icy blue eyes scanning the room until they landed, with the precision of a sniper, on the beta standing by the map. Who, Kyle rumbled, the sound vibrating in Malcolm's very marrow, just touched my map. The other officers shrunk back, but Malcolm simply adjusted his glasses, his Witch Hazel scent coiled tight and hidden deep beneath his skin. The terrain was inaccurate, General, Malcolm said, his voice terrifyingly level. I merely updated the truth. Chapter 2, Into the Lion's Den. The silence in the war room was not an absence of sound, but a physical weight. It was the silence of a vacuum before a storm. General Kyle Avila did not walk back toward the tactical table, he stalked. Every step was a deliberate, heavy strike against the polished floor. His scent, the biting, crystalline essence of winter frost, surged forward like a physical tide, intended to drown the insolent officer who had dared to touch his map. Most betas in the room were already looking at the floor, their breathing shallow, their instinct screaming at them to flee a predator's territory. But Malcolm Case didn't move. He stood behind the flickering holographic display, his spine a rigid line of defiance. Beneath the fabric of his high-collared uniform, his skin pricked. The suppressants were holding, but the general's aura was like a blizzard hammering against a thin glass window. Update the truth. Kyle's voice was a low, dangerous purr as he came to a halt on the opposite side of the table. He was a head taller than Malcolm, his shoulders broad enough to blot out the light of the overhead projectors. The truth is dictated by the High Command, Officer. Case. Logistics, Grade 4, Malcolm replied. He met the General's gaze, an act of pure suicide for an unranked Omega. And with all due respect, General, High Command cannot dictate the structural integrity of a geothermal shelf. If you send the 4th Battalion through Blackreach, the heat-sink vibrations will collapse the pass. You won't bottle the enemy, you'll bury your own men. Kyle leaned forward, his gloved hands gripping the edge of the holographic table. The winter frost scent intensified, turning sharp and jagged, designed to trigger the primal flight response in any subordinate. It was a psychic crushing force, a dominance meant to make the weak kneel. Malcolm felt his knees tremble, a physiological betrayal, but he countered it with a mental trick. He visualized his own scent, the spicy, medicinal Witch Hazel, not as a cloud, but as a concentrated, frozen core deep in his chest. He tightened his pheromonal control, refusing to let even a molecule of his stress leak into the air. To Kyle, the man across from him felt like an anomaly. This beta was as cold and unyielding as the permafrost outside. There was no scent of fear, no sour tang of sweat. Just a terrifying, eerie calm. A logistics officer who fancies himself a geologist, Kyle sneered, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of predatory curiosity. Or perhaps a strategist. I fancy myself a man who prefers efficiency over martyrdom, Malcolm countered. He reached out and tapped the map, the violet warning lights reflecting in his glasses. The silent flats to the east are stable. The elevation gives the 4th Battalion the high ground. It's the only move that doesn't end in a casualty report. The officers in the periphery were pale, waiting for the General to snap Malcolm's neck. Instead, Kyle's gaze drifted from the map to Malcolm's throat, where a thin silver suppressant patch was visible beneath his collar. Kyle's nostrils flared. He caught nothing, no heat, no submission, only the faint, sterile smell of the room's air filtration. It frustrated him. It fascinated him. The 4th Battalion moves as I ordered, Kyle said, his voice dropping to a whisper that only Malcolm could hear. But you are coming with me to the forward command center. If the ground so much as trembles at Blackreach, I will personally see you court-martialed for treason. But if you're right. Kyle reached across the table, his hand hovering inches from Malcolm's face. The sheer heat of the Alpha's body was a violent contrast to his frost-like scent. If you're right, logistics officer Case, I might have a use for a man who doesn't know how to flinch. Malcolm didn't pull away. He looked directly into the storm of the General's eyes and gave a sharp, clinical nod. Then I suggest we pack, General. We have a war to win. Chapter 3, The Scent of Treason. The forward command center was a brutalist structure of reinforced steel and ice, vibrating with the low-frequency hum of Gaia's war machinery. For Malcolm, it was a pressure cooker. Inside the General's private strategy sanctum, the winter frost was no longer a passing breeze, it was the atmosphere. Kyle Avila sat at a low table, stripped of his greatcoat, his shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with the tension of a man who hadn't slept in 48 hours. Malcolm stood by the holographic emitters, his fingers trembling, not from fear, but from the metabolic tax of his suppressants. He had taken a double dose to survive the transport, and now his heart was a frantic bird trapped in a cage of ribs. The enemy's 12th Division is repositioning, Kyle grunted, his voice rasping. He looked up, his sharp eyes tracking Malcolm's every movement. They're spooked by the shift in the 4th. You predicted the collapse at Blackreach, Case. Now predict their retreat. Malcolm opened his mouth to answer, but a sudden, sharp heat flared at the base of his skull. The silver patch beneath his collar felt like it was searing his skin. The air in the room was too dry, too cold, and the General's alpha scent was acting like a solvent, slowly dissolving the chemical barriers Malcolm had painstakingly built. General, the retreat path is, Malcolm choked. A single drop of sweat rolled down his temple. Kyle froze. His head tilted, his nostrils flaring with predatory instinct. The sterile, filtered air of the room had been breached. Beneath the smell of metal and cold, something new was blooming. It was sharp, herbal, and dangerously spicy. "What is that?" Kyle asked, his voice dropping to a dangerous register. He rose from his chair, the movement fluid and terrifyingly fast. "It's nothing." "The cooling fans," Malcolm lied, his voice a half-octave higher than usual. He turned back to the maps, desperately trying to focus his mind, to push the Witch Hazel back into the dark corners of his biology. But Kyle was already behind him. The General's heat was a physical wall at Malcolm's back. The winter frost surged, not in aggression this time, but in a sudden, violent surge of recognition. "You're leaking," Kyle whispered, leaning down until his lips were inches from the sensitive junction of Malcolm's neck. "It smells like medicine and spice. Like a forest burning in the rain." Malcolm's breath hitched. He knew he should pull away, but his body was reacting to the proximity of a dominant alpha in a way he couldn't control. The spicy scent of Witch Hazel began to pour out of him in earnest, thick and intoxicating, lacing through the General's frost until the air in the room felt heavy and sweet. "I am a logistics officer," Malcolm gasped, his hand gripping the edge of the tactical table so hard the metal bit into his palm. "Focus on the maps." "The maps are static," Kyle murmured, his hand coming up to hover just above the suppressant patch on Malcolm's neck. He didn't touch it, but the heat from his palm made the adhesive itch. "This is dynamic. You've been hiding, Case. All that calm, all that truth, it was just a cage." Malcolm realized he was trapped, but his mind, the part of him that was a strategist above all else, saw an opening. If he couldn't hide the scent, he would weaponize it. He leaned back, intentionally allowing his shoulder to brush the General's chest. He let a wave of his scent roll out, not a submissive plea, but a sharp, focused burst meant to clarify the mind. "If I am a cage," Malcolm said, turning his head just enough to meet Kyle's burning gaze, "then perhaps you should wonder what I'm keeping inside. Now, look at the 12th Division, General. I've just given you the clarity to see exactly where they're going to die." Kyle stared at him, his pupils blown wide, caught between the urge to claim and the need to command. For the first time in his life, the General's iron-clad resolve wasn't just cracking, it was beginning to melt. Chapter 4, The Siege of Blackreach. The Siege of Blackreach was a symphony of violence, but inside the forward command tank, the only sound was the rhythmic, frantic thrum of the air filtration system struggling to keep up with the war of scents. Outside, the ground groaned under the weight of Gaia's heavy artillery. Inside, the atmosphere was thick enough to taste. Malcolm stood before the primary tactical display, his hands hovering over the light grid. He had stopped wearing the extra suppressant patches, they were useless now. The spicy, medicinal sharp of Witch Hazel had permeated the small space, clashing against the oppressive, sub-zero weight of Kyle's winter frost. "The 4th Battalion is at the mouth of the pass," Kyle growled. He was looming over Malcolm's shoulder, his body radiating a heat that felt like a localized sun. "They are hesitant. I'm giving the order for a full-throttle frontal assault. We break their line now, or we lose the momentum. If you give that order, you are signing their death warrants," Malcolm snapped, spinning around. The movement brought them chest to chest. In the cramped quarters of the command tank, there was nowhere to retreat. Malcolm's eyes were wide, his pupils blown with the sheer strain of resisting an alpha's natural command. He could feel the vibration of Kyle's winter frost in his very teeth. It was an invitation to submit, a demand to be still. "Don't speak to me of death warrants, logistics officer," Kyle hissed, his voice dropping into a register that made the metal floor hum. He stepped closer, forcing Malcolm back against the edge of the tactical table. "I am the General. My resolve is what keeps this empire from crumbling. Move aside." "No." Malcolm didn't just say it, he threw the word like a flashbang. He tapped into the well of pheromonal control he had spent a lifetime perfecting. Usually, he used it to dampen his presence. Now, he inverted it. He allowed the Witch Hazel to surge, but he didn't let it become soft or inviting. He sharpened it into a needle-fine point of safe harbor, a scent so intensely focused it mimicked the neurological stop command of a high-ranking alpha. It was a tactical deception of the highest order. Kyle froze. His hand, which had been reaching for the comms array to signal the charge, stayed suspended in midair. His nostrils flared, his brain momentarily short-circuiting as the Witch Hazel flooded his senses, tricking his instincts into believing the threat had already been neutralized. "What are you doing to me?" Kyle whispered, his eyes narrowing as he fought the sudden, inexplicable wave of calm that was washing over his aggression. "I'm saving your army," Malcolm breathed, his face inches from Kyle's. He could see the frost on the general's eyelashes, the sheer, terrifying beauty of a man built for war. "Look at the seismic readings, Kyle. Look at them with your eyes, not your pride." For a heartbeat, the winter frost flickered. The Predator's dominance wavered, replaced by a raw, naked confusion. Malcolm didn't move. He held the scent lock, his own heart racing so fast he thought it might burst. He was an unranked Omega holding a general at bay with nothing but a spicy scent and a terrifyingly sharp mind. The iron-clad resolve of General Avila didn't just crack, it shivered. Kyle's hand dropped from the console and gripped Malcolm's waist, pulling him flush against the cold metals on his uniform. "You are a dangerous man, Malcolm Case," Kyle rasped, his forehead dropping to rest against Malcolm's. "You're rewriting the laws of the Empire in a room that smells like a forest fire." "Then let it burn," Malcolm replied, his fingers finally reaching out to override the assault order. "We win this my way." Chapter 5, The Fragile Barrier. The command center's heavy blast doors hissed shut, the sound echoing like a guillotine blade hitting its mark. General Kyle Avila's private quarters were a stark reflection of the man, cold, efficient, and smelling of ancient stone and winter frost. There were no soft edges here, save for the tactical maps scattered across a low mahogany desk. "Sit," Kyle commanded. It wasn't a request. The Alpha's voice carried the weight of a physical blow, vibrating through the small space. Malcolm didn't sit. He stood in the center of the room, his breath hitching. The air here was trapped, undiluted by the industrial scrubbers of the war room. It was just the two of them, and for the first time, Malcolm felt the sheer scale of the predator he had been baiting. Without the distraction of soldiers or screens, Kyle's presence was a mountain of ice ready to slide. "You've been playing a very dangerous game, Case," Kyle said, slowly unbuckling his ceremonial sword belt and dropping it onto the desk with a heavy thud. He began to peel off his tactical gloves, his eyes never leaving Malcolm's. "You've countered my orders. You've hacked my instincts. And you've done it all while smelling like a beta who's been dipped in a pharmacy. I am a logistics officer, General. My rank." "Your rank is a lie," Kyle interrupted, stepping into Malcolm's personal space. The heat radiating from the general was staggering. Kyle reached out, his thumb hooking under the edge of Malcolm's high collar. He didn't rip it, he simply applied enough pressure to make the silver suppressant patch visible. "Betas don't need industrial-grade neuroblockers to stay upright in my presence," Kyle whispered, his voice dropping to a gravelly, intimate low. "And they certainly don't have a scent that can turn a general's blood to liquid fire." With a swift, practiced motion, Kyle peeled the patch away. The reaction was instantaneous. Without the chemical barrier, the Witch Hazel scent exploded into the room, no longer a subtle hint, but a roar of spicy, sharp, and intoxicating pheromones. It was the scent of an Omega, yes, but it lacked the frantic, submissive sweetness the Empire expected. It was the scent of a strategist, precise, overwhelming, and utterly dominant in its own right. Malcolm gasped, his knees finally buckling as the sudden sensory rush hit him. Kyle caught him before he hit the floor, his massive arms locking around Malcolm's waist, pulling him flush against his chest. "An unranked Omega," Kyle breathed, his face buried in the crook of Malcolm's neck, inhaling the raw, unfiltered truth. Hidden in the belly of the war machine. You're a ghost, Malcolm. A beautiful, terrifying ghost. Malcolm's hands found purchase on Kyle's shoulders, his fingers digging into the heavy fabric of the general's uniform. Does it matter? Malcolm rasped, his voice thick with the biological pull of the bond. Does the rank change the maps? Does it change the fact that I'm the only one who can see the path to victory? Kyle pulled back just enough to look Malcolm in the eye. The winter frost hadn't disappeared, but it had changed. It was no longer a weapon used to crush, it was a cage meant to protect. It changes everything, Kyle murmured, his thumb tracing the line of Malcolm's jaw. The Empire thinks I'm the predator. They think I'm the one who holds the leash. But in this room, in the dark, I realized I've been the one being hunted all along. Kyle leaned in, his lips hovering a hair's breadth from Malcolm's. You didn't just outsmart my army, Malcolm. You outsmarted me. The general's iron-clad resolve didn't just break, it surrendered. For the first time in his life, Kyle Avila wasn't looking for a subordinate to follow orders, he was looking for the only person in the Gaia Empire who was his equal. Chapter 6, Weaponizing the Bond. The map room of the Forward Command Center was no longer a place of sterile military theory, it had become an altar to a dangerous, symbiotic resonance. The enemy's pincer movement was closing in. On the holographic display, the red icons of the rebel coalition were swarming toward the Gaia Empire's vulnerable flank. The high-ranking alphas on the general's staff were shouting, their scents clashing in a sour, metallic discord of panic. Silence, Kyle commanded. The room went still, but it wasn't the general's voice that held them. It was the atmosphere. Malcolm stood at Kyle's right hand, no longer wearing the high collar of a subordinate. His scent, Witch Hazel, was flowing freely now, a sharp, medicinal spice that seemed to weave through the frozen air of Kyle's winter frost. Malcolm didn't look at the other officers. He looked only at Kyle. He could feel the general's heart rate through the proximity of their bond, a low, thrumming engine of aggression that was currently tuned to the wrong frequency. Kyle was preparing for a scorched earth defense, a move that would win the battle but lose the war's soul. He's too rigid, Malcolm thought. I have to break the ice. Malcolm stepped closer, his hand brushing against Kyle's arm. It was a calculated touch. He didn't just release his scent, he shaped it. He focused on the memory of the safe harbor he had created before, but added a layer of predatory sharpness. He was hacking the Alpha's brain, using their brand new, fragile bond as a fiber optic cable for tactical data. Kyle, Malcolm whispered, the name a jagged strike against the general's composure. Don't swing the hammer. Become the shadow. The general's breath hitched. To the rest of the room, it looked like a strategist advising his commander. But internally, Kyle was experiencing a sensory revolution. The Witch Hazel was sinking into his pores, cooling the white-hot rage of his battle trance and replacing it with a terrifying, crystalline clarity. Malcolm's pheromones were acting as a biological compass, guiding Kyle's instincts away from the frontal assault and toward a complex, multi-layered feint. The 12th Division, Kyle muttered, his eyes glazing over as he surrendered his will to the scent path Malcolm was laying down. We don't meet them. We let them take the valley. We let them think they've won. Exactly, Malcolm breathed, his scent surging with a spike of triumph. And then we close the lid. The officers whispered in hushed, terrified tones. They could see the change in their general. The Coldhearted Predator was moving with a fluidity they had never seen, his commands coming out with a precision that felt almost supernatural. He wasn't just leading, he was being channeled. Malcolm watched as the red icons on the map began to shift, lured into the trap by Kyle's newfound patience. By weaponizing the bond, Malcolm had turned the Alpha General into the ultimate weapon, one that moved with the savage strength of an Alpha but the intricate, devastating foresight of an Omega. Kyle turned to Malcolm, his eyes dark with a mixture of awe and subjection. The iron-clad resolve was gone, replaced by a devastatingly effective union. "You aren't just telling me how to win, Malcolm," Kyle rasped, loud enough only for the strategist to hear. "You're rewritten the way I think." "I'm not rewriting you, Kyle," Malcolm replied, his spicy scent curling around the general's frost. "I'm just finally giving you the eyes to see the truth." Chapter 7: The Shattering of Resolve. The frost outside the command center had begun to crystallize on the interior glass, creeping inward like the reaching fingers of a ghost. But inside the war room, the air was a different kind of cold. It was the electric, pressurized silence of a terminal event. The holographic map was a sea of red. The Gaia Empire's lines hadn't just buckled, they had vanished. The enemy was at the perimeter, their heavy shells shaking the foundation of the bunker. Dust fell from the ceiling like gray snow, settling on the shoulders of General Kyle Avila. "The first and third are gone," a sub-commander shouted over the roar of a distant explosion. "General, we have to retreat to the inner sanctum. We have to make a final stand." Kyle didn't move. He stood at the head of the table, his winter frost scent turning jagged and wild, a blizzard of pure, unadulterated aggression. He looked like a god of old, prepared to die in a ruin of his own making. His hand hovered over the Omega Protocol, a scorched earth command that would detonate the thermal vents, killing the enemy but vaporizing every Gaia soldier in the valley. "Kyle, stop." Malcolm's voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the chaos like a diamond through glass. He stepped into the light of the dying holographic display. He had discarded his military tunic. His white shirt was damp with the sheer physical effort of what he was about to do. "Move aside, Malcolm," Kyle growled, his eyes glowing with a terrifying, rhythmic light. "This is a soldier's end. I will not let them take this ground." "You're not losing ground, Kyle. You're losing your mind to your own pride." Malcolm didn't wait for a rebuttal. He closed the distance, stepping directly into the eye of the general's storm. He reached out and grabbed Kyle's jaw, forcing the Alpha to look at him. Then, Malcolm let go of every remaining thread of his control. The Witch Hazel didn't just leak out, it detonated. It was a massive, concentrated surge of pheromones that carried no sweetness, no submissive heat. It was the scent of a storm wall, an authoritative, undeniable wave of pure intuition. It crashed into Kyle's winter frost and didn't just melt it, it consumed it. The general gasped, his knees hitting the metal floor with a heavy thud. The officers around them froze, staring in horror as their invincible leader was brought low by an unranked strategist. "Look at me," Malcolm commanded, his voice vibrating with the power of the surge. "The enemy isn't at the gates, Kyle. They're in the trap you built for them 3 hours ago. If you detonate those vents now, you're killing the victors." Kyle's breath came in ragged shudders. The safe harbor scent was gone, replaced by a pheromonal command that only a true strategist could wield. It was a psychological siege. Kyle felt his iron-clad resolve, the very thing that defined him, shatter into 1,000 glass shards. He looked up at Malcolm, and for the first time, the cold-hearted predator was gone. In his eyes was a profound, terrifying surrender. He wasn't yielding to an enemy, he was yielding to a truth he had been too proud to see. "The command." Kyle rasped, his hand falling away from the Omega Protocol button. He reached up, his fingers trembling as they gripped Malcolm's wrists. "The command is yours. All of it. Me, the army, the empire. Just get us through the dark." "I already have," Malcolm whispered. With a final, sharp flick of his wrist, Malcolm bypassed the general's biometrics and initiated the Ghost Maneuver. On the map, the hidden Gaia units, the ones Malcolm had secretly repositioned while Kyle was blinded by his own dominance, sprang from the ridges like a trapdoor spider. The Alpha General stayed on his knees, his forehead resting against Malcolm's stomach, breathing in the scent of the man who had systematically dismantled his soul only to save it. The war room was silent, save for the sound of an empire being reborn under a new kind of power. Chapter 8: The New Empire. The war for the Gaia Empire did not end with a bang, but with a collective, stunned intake of breath. When the smoke cleared over the silent flats, the invincible, rebel coalition had been dismantled with a surgical precision that defied every known manual of alpha warfare. The victory was absolute. But in the gold-leafed halls of the Imperial Palace, the celebration was muted by a growing, frantic whisper: the general has changed. 3 months after the siege of Blackreach, the Grand Hall was prepared for the Victory Gala. High-ranking alphas from across the star system stood in rigid rows, their chests heavy with medals, their scents aggressive and competing. They were waiting for Kyle Avila, the Coldhearted Predator, the Iron General, to take his place on the dais and reaffirm the dominance of the Old Guard. The heavy oak doors swung open. Kyle Avila entered, but he did not walk alone. He didn't even walk in front. He walked a half-step behind Malcolm Case. The silence that followed was deafening. Malcolm was no longer wearing the drab, gray slate of a logistics officer. He wore the midnight blue silk of a high strategist, his collar open, his silver suppressant patches gone forever. The scent of Witch Hazel, spicy, medicinal, and sharp, no longer lurked in the corners of the room. It claimed the space. It moved through the hall like a sentient tide, and where it touched the aggressive alphas, their posturing faltered. Beside him, Kyle's winter frost had lost its jagged, lethal edge. It was no longer a blizzard meant to blind, it was a steady, rhythmic chill that acted as a foundation for Malcolm's heat. They didn't just walk together, their scents had merged into a singular, imperial atmosphere that redefined the room's gravity. "The council is concerned, General," a duke whispered as they approached the throne. "The hierarchy, the traditional roles of Alpha and Omega, they are the bedrock of Gaia." Kyle stopped. He didn't growl. He didn't even look at the duke. He looked at Malcolm, his eyes full of a terrifying, quiet devotion that made the council members recoil. "The bedrock of Gaia was brittle," Kyle said, his voice echoing with a new kind of authority, one tempered by surrender. "I spent my life breaking things to prove I was strong. Malcolm showed me that true power isn't in the breaking. It's in the design." Kyle reached out, and in front of the entire Imperial court, he took Malcolm's hand. He didn't grip it like a prize, he held it like a lifeline. "The general leads the army," Kyle announced, his gaze finally sweeping the room with a flash of his old intensity. "But the strategist leads the general. If any of you have a grievance with the new order, I suggest you take it up with the man who outsmarted me while I was trying to kill him." No one spoke. They couldn't. The combined pressure of their sense was an undeniable mandate. Later that night, on the private balcony overlooking the capital, the Imperial lights twinkled like fallen stars. Malcolm leaned against the stone railing, the cool night air mingling with the spicy warmth of his skin. "You didn't have to do that," Malcolm murmured as Kyle stepped up behind him, wrapping his massive, fur-lined coat around both of them. "The council will be terrified of you now." "Let them be terrified," Kyle whispered into the crook of Malcolm's neck, his breath hitching as he inhaled the scent that had rewritten his soul. "I've spent my whole life being a predator, Malcolm. It's much more interesting being your weapon." Malcolm turned in the general's arms, smiling as he traced the line of Kyle's jaw. The unranked strategist had done more than just win a war, he had shattered the iron-clad resolve of an empire and built something much more resilient in its place. "The maps are clear for the next 10 years, Kyle," Malcolm said, his eyes bright with the thrill of a new game. Kyle pulled him closer, the winter frost and Witch Hazel finally settling into a perfect, permanent peace. "Then I suggest we get started. I'm eager to see what else you have in mind." Epilogue. The cold of the Gaia Empire stayed strictly outside the heavy, dark-timbered walls of Kyle's private estate. For the first time since the Frostline campaign began, the air wasn't pressurized by the hum of servers or the frantic scent of dying men. The bedroom was illuminated only by the low, amber glow of a dying fire. There were no maps spread across the tables, no holographic grids burning their retinas. Even the uniforms, those stiff, metal-heavy shells they had lived in for months, lay discarded in a careless heap on the floor. Kyle stood by the edge of the expansive bed, stripped down to a simple black undershirt that strained against the sheer breadth of his shoulders. Without the greatcoat, he looked less like a monument of war and more like a man. His winter frost scent had settled into something soft and clean, like the first snowfall on a quiet forest. Malcolm sat on the edge of the mattress, his hair messy, his glasses resting on the nightstand. Without the high strategist persona, he looked younger, his skin glowing in the firelight. The Witch Hazel was no longer a tactical weapon, it was a warm, inviting spice that filled the room, wrapping around Kyle's chill like a blanket. "You're thinking again," Kyle murmured, his voice a low vibration that seemed to pull Malcolm toward him. He stepped between Malcolm's knees, his large hands coming up to cup the strategist's face. "The war is over, Malcolm. Stop calculating the next move." Malcolm leaned into the touch, his eyes fluttering shut. "It's a hard habit to break. I keep looking for the flank, the weakness." "There is no weakness here," Kyle whispered. He tilted Malcolm's head back, his thumb tracing the pale, unmarked skin of his neck, the place where the silver patches used to live. The air in the room shifted. The playful tension of the evening suddenly sharpened into something ancient and inevitable. Kyle's nostrils flared as the Witch Hazel scent spiked, turning sweet and heavy with a silent invitation. Kyle leaned down, his lips brushing against Malcolm's ear. "I've surrendered my army to you. I've surrendered my pride. There's only one thing left." Malcolm's breath hitched as Kyle's teeth grazed the sensitive junction of his shoulder. The general wasn't asking for a tactical advantage, he was asking for a permanent tether. Malcolm reached up, his fingers tangling in Kyle's hair, pulling him closer. "Do it," Malcolm rasped. "Mark the map, Kyle. Claim the territory." Kyle didn't hesitate. His kiss was a sudden, passionate conquest, tasting of salt and heat. As they tumbled back onto the furs, the weight of the Alpha was a grounding force, a solid reality after months of shadows and ghosts. In the quiet of the night, Kyle finally pressed his mark into the crook of Malcolm's neck. It wasn't a shattering of resolve this time, but a forging of it. The winter frost and the Witch Hazel didn't just mingle, they locked together, creating a scent bond so strong it felt like its own empire. As Kyle pulled the heavy velvet covers over them, shielding them from the world, the general let out a long, shuddering breath of contentment. The strategist had won his final battle, and the predator had finally found his home.